Thank you, Boris. I'll start right away by alerting you that since English is an official language, and since we're both suffering from grave jet lag, which impairs our ability to сообщаться эффективно по-русски, we're going to use English. We will speak slowly, and we can't help speaking loudly, so that's okay. And I want to thank Boris Ivanovich for inviting us to this conference. This is the first time I've been at a Russian history conference, and I think Adele can say the same, with colleagues from Russia and from elsewhere in this part of the world for 3-4 years. And it's just great to be in the midst of people who make this the center of their research. I'd also like to thank Amiran and Artur for their efforts and their quick answers to my infinite questions. And so what we're going to do today is with the discussion time we've been allotted, we are going to discuss the project that you see behind me on the screen. And then there's a real issue because we're talking about Kavkazский вопрос, российская история, right? But the problem is we have 300 contributors to this collection, which is now 22 books. I think we only have 4 or 5 articles on Kavkaz. 2 of them are by your colleague Vadim Mukhanov, who contributed a pair of articles on the Sovietization of Azerbaijan and Armenia in one article, and the other on Georgia, and is published in one of our books on that's called The Arc of Revolution, how the revolutions in the Russian center reverberate through the near beyond.
Show the book.
And here's, this is the book here. Yeah, Global Impact of Russia's Revolution. Now, I have a chapter in another book in this volume that has its roots in the Caucasus because it deals with the Dukaborцы and living in Canada and how they react to the revolution. But there's interesting implications of Dukaborцы being down here in the first place. Also, we have Leoncy Lanik, who has contributed 2 chapters on various aspects, first of the German experience on the Eastern Front, and secondly, the German encounter with the whites in the south of Russia, now an area of contestation, unfortunately. And finally, Boris Ivanovich was an invaluable contributor to this series' success and well-being, and was an editor or co-editor on several books in the collection, most notably on Russian thought and culture from 1914 to 1922, and on a very interesting collection basically generated in Switzerland on ego documents and memoirs and diaries and how they reflect different people's experience of the war, but especially the revolution and the aftermath of the revolution. And these include peasants in the Glush, and they include royalty. And it's a very interesting collection. And Adele served as editor, co-editor of a couple of volumes, and I serve as a general editor and as a co-editor of several volumes in the series as well. Now, what we want to do today, and I'll let Adele introduce herself in a second, but what we want to do today is we're going to divide it into 2 parts. First, describing the series and how it came about and what makes it distinctive and probably historically unique now. And the second, we want to address the problem of the empire and the lack of attention to Kavkaz in this collection. Now,
start with, well, why don't you, first, I will briefly introduce myself. Прошу прощения, что я буду говорить по-английски. Я плохо владею научным русским языком, так как я не хочу оскорблять ваши уши, и буду говорить по-английски. My name is Adele Lindenmeyr. As you heard, I'm professor of history and also dean of arts and sciences at Villanova University, which is near the city of Philadelphia. I am extremely grateful to European University, the Yerevan Center for International Education, Boris Ivanovich, Amiran, and Artur for this extraordinary opportunity to participate in this exceptional conference. This is my first visit to Caucasus, my first visit to Yerevan. It might be my last, I hope not, but I'm very, very grateful for this extraordinary opportunity. So David was one of the founders of this project. He is the source, источник всего. And so David, explain how this project, why this project came about. Where did the idea come from?
All right, this all starts with a coincidence. Some of you might know there's an organization of scholars of, it used to be called the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies. And it was in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2006. We have a friend, the other two general editors are Anthony Haywood, Tony Haywood at the University of Aberdeen, and John Steinberg, who's a military historian who teaches at Austin Peay State University in Tennessee. Well, both of us, Tony and I, approached John at a cafe in the hotel at the same time with the same idea. I'd like to say this like Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin simultaneously coming up with natural selection, but that's probably overplaying it. But what we said was really needed was some kind of compilation or collective work that could produce for English language readers a substantial record of the Russian Empire's experience of the Great War and the revolution. We argued whether it should be revolutions or revolution. And we also argued about 1914 as opposed to 1905, 1893, and 1922. Could it be 1939? Could it be 1981? Whatever. But we wanted something that would reflect the state of scholarship among our colleagues as it existed at the time. We also wanted for English language readers to provide a record and an analysis from various perspectives of Russia's experience, because it was very little covered. It was more or less neglected. And it was neglected first because the war wasn't treated. The war was either a coda, an end.
Or it was all the Western Front.
Yeah, well, all the Western Front, yes. But within Russian historiography, it was either the end to the empire, the Romanovs, whereas if you were a Soviet historian, and I'm being very reductionist here, the parts of imperial history that interested you were really what leads to November 17. And beyond that, there wasn't much obligation. There not a lot of conversation between the two, some, but also there were fewer books in English on the Eastern Front and on Russia's role in it than there were, and I'll speak about my country, than there are about Canada and Canada's contribution. So there was a bias that was really hard to overcome with publishers and like. So we talked about it.
And also, since we talked about Jubilee this morning, the 100th anniversary
That's right.
of the beginning of the Great War was approaching, and the 100th anniversary of the 1917 revolutions.
Yes, that's thank you. And we wanted to make an argument through the collection that the war itself merited separate study, or at least discrete study. Because already by that time you were starting to get discussions about whether the war served to as a transformer belt to the revolution, like a lot of the policies the Bolsheviks follow in the early 1920s, were measures initiated in the emergency conditions of the war by the imperial government, or whether 1917 marks a decisive rupture in the history of modern Russia and the Associated States. So what we did was to start working out these things through a series of conferences, first in Aberdeen in 2008, which is where we first met Boris Ivanovich and a lot of other Russian scholars, because we also wanted it to be international. And there was basically two models that we had in mind. One was the idea of a collective study, which John Steinberg had helped take part in, with dealing with the Russo-Japanese War in 2005. An international conference from various disciplines dealing with various aspects of the war from the point of view of that discipline. So you've got a lot of perspectives. And it came out in 2 volumes with Brill. It was called World War Zero, with a very suggestive title. And the other model was a collection put out by emigre Russians in between the wars, sponsored by the Carnegie Foundation, that gave a general survey of the war.
Russia in the Great War.
Russia in the Great War. And so we had conference in Aberdeen in 2008, and then in 2009, a conference in Madison, Wisconsin, in my home institution, which started to lead to decision of, we started identifying thematic approaches, and here's where I'll defer to Adele.
So I joined the project in 2008 at the conference in Madison, and I eventually participated in the production of 5 of the 22 books. And as I think about it, the theme of our conference here, устанавливая и преодолевая границы, is very relevant to what we embarked on more than 15 years ago. We tried to question chronological boundaries, the boundary of 1917 in particular, to look at with fresh eyes whether 1917 was a turning point in history, both of Russia and of world history, and to look at if it was a turning point, for whom, in what ways, but also to look at what the continuities were, to look for continuities in this entire period that one of our American specialists in Russian history, Peter Holquist, termed a continuum of crisis. This period from summer 1914 to, and that's where we ran into trouble. When does it end? We eventually picked 1922. But as some of the chapters reveal, the crisis continued into the middle of the 1920s, or in other areas, life began to return to a new normal earlier than 1922. In thinking about this question of turning points and boundaries, chronological boundaries, I think our overall conclusion is that yes, 1917 in certain respects was a major turning point, a rupture, certainly in international affairs, in diplomatic history. It certainly led, for the lives of many people, for institutions, for certain institutions, the monarchy, for example, to a decisive break. But in other areas of people's experience during this period, we began to become more aware of the continuities. And the more you look for them, the more you find them. When we began to look at cultural history in this period, the history of science and technology, the continuities with the pre-war period became more apparent. And that would also be true, I think, in what we learned about the history of national movements, nationalities becoming aware and advocating for their political rights. And more, it seemed that the real turning point for Russian history, as we were looking at it in this very comprehensive way, the real turning point was summer 1914.
Now, I'll come back in and just tell everybody, we did not insist on interpretation, editorial interpretation,
Exactly.
because there was a lot of debate. There were very staunch defenders who would say that 1917 was a decisive turning point and have a lot of material to make that argument. It was very hard now to find people who would study workers, which used to be, for 20 years preceding, had been a real, or longer before that, had been a real focus of a lot of historical attention. You didn't find any new work on that. No
new work on Bolsheviks.
On Bolsheviks. Now, what we did have was a series of themes that emerged very clearly. A first set that were military history of the war itself, and then the Civil War, culture and thought, domestic, the home front, and we were soon augmented by a group of scholars already doing a project on the home front in terms of regions within Russia and Ukraine, the
local revolutions.
The local revolutions and how they experienced. A volume on international relations, both getting into the war, through the war, and then in the Civil War, and then with the beginnings of new Soviet diplomacy. I'm just trying to think what else the Central Powers and their experience on the Eastern Front vis-a-vis the Russian and Soviet states, including prisoners of war out in Siberia, the Czech prisoners who become the Czechoslovak Legion and the like. I'm trying to think what else. Oh yeah, and the East Asia, and the Far East. And editorial boards, there were usually four people on a team. They always included a Russian, a North American, a European, and then there would be some player. And our contributions come from every continent outside Antarctica, and we're still waiting for that one. But so what we wanted was big reach, but we grew, right?
We did. As David mentioned, there will be a total of 22 books, two final books to come in 11 thematic volumes, more than 300 chapters by 250 different authors, articles in 6 different languages, all translated into English. It was not possible for us to, unfortunately, publish a multilingual series, but our audience included our North American or English-speaking colleagues whose fixation in studying this period had been on the Western Front, had been on Western European history, and we really sought to, if we had an editorial position,
that was it.
That was it. We sought to restore Russia and Eurasia to its proper place in world history, in the study of world history at this time. As David mentioned, our geographic diversity extended from the Eastern Front to the Far East. Articles looked at what was going on within ministries and what was going on within factories and villages. We include both public and private life, and in the books that I participated in, two of the books that I participated in, we were especially interested in looking at the experience of this period of crisis in the lives of individuals, from elites to the members of the Narod. So personal experience came in as well. And I think it's fair to say, well, maybe you can be the judge. I think this series reflects the current state of the field. For example, not much study of Bolsheviks anymore. Perhaps we just didn't find those new voices, but it very much reflects the current state of the field. What are historians interested in? It reveals how much the field has changed. Certainly, to me, I went to graduate school in the 1970s, and the field, the Russian history that I studied back then was very influenced, for example, by the theory of modernization. I went to Princeton University, which was like the birthplace of modernization theory. Our field has changed so dramatically. It's so much more dynamic, so much more expansive. And I want to just say a few words about how many different historical methodologies are reflected in this series. Methodologies of understanding historical experience that did not exist when I was a graduate student. So I made a list, if you'll bear with me, of, by my count, 17 different historical methodologies that our authors used in this series. Not all at once, of course, but the different approaches. Military history, political history, economic, social, and demographic history. Of course, diplomatic history, but also international and transnational history. The history of nationalities as well as the history of empire. Cultural history, intellectual history, the history of women and gender, biography, science and technology, the history of memory, and last but not least, environmental history. Many of these subfields of history really have emerged in the last few decades, and they are reflected in the diversity of contributions to these volumes.
Great. There's strengths and weaknesses to taking this approach of the snapshot, right? We want to reflect the diversity of discussion. We want to reflect the diversity of approaches, and also the diversity of different perspectives from different areas, not just disciplines, but our national backgrounds make a difference in how we understand and what value we assign to these events or to certain points in them. But as we found out, we finally had a last conference in August.
This year.
Of August this year, right? It was the last thing, August this year. And we ended up spending a lot of time dwelling on what we were missing and what had changed. For instance, it's ironic that the thinnest volume in the field dealt with nations and empire. And this at a time when the history of empire was becoming very important in our field. You think of the appearance of Ab Imperio and several other collections, at least in English, but I'm sure in German and British institutions as well. But beyond that, there are other absences that we took note of. And the other thing, and we can take a break right now because that's the time prescribed, but there's a pervasive Russocentrism that now seems a little over-centralized. But generally, there's that link. I'll ask Amiran, sorry to impose on you to, since you probably have an e-list, I'll ask Amiran to share that link with you. It'll take you to the publisher's website. The publisher is Slavica in the University of Indiana University. And we had a very nice understanding with them. They've been extremely helpful in producing the series. And they've done a nice quality of publication, but also they've digitized almost all of it so far.
We should mention that nobody wanted to publish this project.
They wanted to publish military history.
They just wanted the volumes on the Eastern Front. And we insisted that we were, in the words of the Three Musketeers, one for all and all for one, and indivisible. So we were most fortunate to find a small but high quality publishing house, Slavica, at Indiana University that would take all volumes. And we didn't even know at that time how many there would be.
Yeah, their feeling was it would make it easier to meet their quota for history books. So, as I say, entertain comments from the moderator, and he's going to be a participant next session. But also any immediate questions from the floor, happy to answer. Задайте вопрос по-русски, либо по-английски, либо, если хотите, по-французски.
Если не по-армянски, не по-армянски, пожалуйста.
Спасибо.
Да.
Я добавлю пару слов, если можно. Это был очень интересный опыт, и как бы этот проект еще не закончился на самом деле, потому что несколько томов еще должно выйти.
Еще
один, да?
Две книжки.
С этим проектом невозможно предсказать, сколько в конце будет, потому что количество томов всегда увеличивалось по ходу дела. Но как минимум один том еще выйдет. То есть, но с другой стороны, проект стал уже каким-то историографическим фактом, потому что много используется, много цитируется, много используется на занятиях и в классах на самом деле. И видны плюсы и минусы этого проекта, и не может быть без минусов. Но для меня это был очень интересный опыт участия в таком огромном международном и плохо контролируемом, то есть хорошо организованном, но плохо контролируемом проекте, потому что, как уже сказал Дэвид, какие-то партизаны к нам присоединялись по ходу дела, но с другой стороны этот проект имел такое качество, он порождал новые проекты и субпроекты, и движение разных команд к томам было очень разным. Потому что, допустим, том Nations and Empires, так он называется. Алексей, по-моему, тоже участвовал в этом.
Да.
И там была конференция в Петербурге, где доклады были апробированы, и от этого они стали еще лучше. В нашем томе, когда мы работали, тоже было две таких конференции апробационные. Одна прошла в Европейском университете в Санкт-Петербурге, другая в Клемсоне в Южной Каролине. И это тоже способствовало как-то работе над томом. И это порождало еще что-то. И я согласен, что том, с одной стороны, тома этой серии, они констатировали состояние историографии, хотя, может быть, не полное, потому что не все национальные историографии мы знаем. И так. Но, с другой стороны, указывает на какие-то лакуны, какие-то есть. А лакуны – это возможности. Если говорить о возможностях, которые я ощущаю, то это сравнительное изучение регионов, сравнительное изучение национальных проектов, которое очень важно для этого периода. И то, чем я тоже занимаюсь, и это немножко тоже продолжает проект, небольшая группа вместе со мной, мы изучаем политические языки войны и революции, и если бы была возможность делать что-то сравнительно, то мы были бы рады и счастливы, и мы рады сотрудничать тут и с армянскими, и с грузинскими коллегами. Есть уже какая-то небольшая книга, которую я с радостью вручу. В общем, этот проект, он иногда начал жить своей собственной жизнью. И он еще не кончился. Спасибо.